Perfect. Thank you so much, Shane. I am going to be speaking first. Firstly, welcome everybody. My name is Cara Levy and I'm the marketing manager at Petco, the PET plastic recycling company. Welcome to all of you. We've had a lot of signups for this webinar today, and it just shows that there's a great interest in the space, which is very encouraging. The sessions that we host on design for circularity have always been important, but now more than ever, they have actually become vital. With the introduction of mandatory EPR legislation, it's no longer optional to design with circularity and recycling in mind. We are operating to meet targets for recycling and collection, for inclusion of rPET, and we will soon be operating with eco-modulation. These changes have implications around compliance for producers in South Africa. We have always been a few years behind our friends internationally on some topics around EPR. This means that we have the benefit of learning from what has happened and hopefully are then informed to make good choices in the local market. Before we kick off, here are some ground rules for this morning's proceedings. You have all been muted by default and your cameras have been disengaged. Lastly, we know that 80% of virtual meeting attendees regard flawless audio as a key requirement for holding successful meetings. While we have tested everything to ensure smooth transitions, gremlins are known to creep in from time to time, and we ask for your patience and grace should this happen. Please note that the session will be recorded and sent to you afterwards. Now, let's have a look at the agenda for the day. We have a jam-packed agenda for this morning, and we are so grateful to have three industry heavyweights with us to share their vast knowledge in their various areas of expertise with us. I will kick us off with an introduction to the topic and why we have decided to host this webinar. I will then hand over to Stijn Billiet, who is the Global Director of Sustainability at MCC Label, who will talk about digital watermarking within Project Holy Grail and the status of the project. We will then hear from Duarte, who is the worldwide Tethered Closure Specialist from Husky, who will be speaking about tethered caps on bottles. And last but not least, Mike Jefferson, manager at Epro, will speak about design for circularity, defining recyclability, use of recycled content, and certification systems within the context of design for circularity. And we will then have a Q&A. So as mentioned, please insert your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to them at the end of the session. Please also direct your questions to the person that you would wish to ask the question to, should you wish to direct it to someone. To start off, Petco is a registered producer responsibility organization, or PRO, looking after PET bottles operating in South Africa. We are a membership-based organization, and we are paid an EPR fee by our members, who are producers who place more than 10 tons of PET packaging onto the South African market. We then put various initiatives in place to ensure that their packaging is collected and recycled. So what do we do? Petco was incorporated in 2004 as a voluntary organization to minimize the environmental impact of plastic bottles in the environment, and has been steadily increasing recycling rates from just 16% in 2005 to 63% in 2021. We have financially supported bottle-to-bottle recycling, meaning that circular recycling and food-grade rPET is now the end destination for 1/3 of Petco's total collection, and this is what we are focused on growing. We understand that we have come a long way, but we also know that we have a long way to go. As Petco, we focus on value chain engagement and aim to facilitate the closing of the loop. We aim to ensure that packaging is designed to be recycled, that consumers know which products can be recycled and do recycle, working with municipalities to help to implement recycling infrastructure, ensuring that waste pickers are integrated and have access to recyclables, and that there are end uses available that create demand for recycled material. So where are we going? What I spoke about in the last slide has been helped by the implementation of mandatory EPR legislation, which came into effect in 2021. We are glad to see that circular design principles have been included, and it is a positive step by the government to compel local producers to take responsibility for their post-consumer packaging waste. So what does this mean? It means that we need to achieve increased collection and recycling rates, and our members need to firstly include increased recycled content in their products, up to 20% by year 5. conduct an LCA on their products by November 2026, and design for circularity in order to avoid the penalties that will come with eco-modulation. The task ahead is big. We need to move towards a circular economy, focusing on design in order to achieve higher value feedstock and closing the loop. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation identifies this as key. They believe that circular design searches for a way to deliver a product or a service which is functional and made of optimum materials to deliver the best performance while minimizing its negative impact along the whole life cycle. In order to facilitate circular design, we first developed design for recycling guidelines in 2009 to assist our members to ensure that the products that they place on the market will be collected and recycled in South Africa. Up until the introduction of mandatory EPR, these guidelines were just used as best practice. Now we will see the implementation of eco-modulation, i.e. the use of regulatory instruments being applied as drivers to drive change, likely through a bonus and malus system, meaning that packaging that is difficult to recycle will have a high EPR fee, and this will have financial implications for businesses. These guidelines will no longer be a nice to have, but a roadmap to achieving regulatory compliance. We now have targets for rPET inclusion, and the guidelines will play a much more pivotal role. However, there have been some wins along the way. As we say, a small change in design can have a huge impact on the system. And as you can see here, you can see PVC cap liners were discontinued, meaning that caps can now go through the PET recycling process. Many bottles have undergone lightweighting, decreasing the amount of plastic used. Sprite bottles have moved from green to clear PET, increasing their value. And one of our members, Happy Culture Kombucha, removes their metallized labels, meaning that their bottles are now 100% recyclable. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of work to be done. This is inside one of our partners' plants, where you can see a large amount of problematic shrink sleeves, which are being cut off manually. These sleeves are causing big issues within our recycling stream. Under eco-modulation, the extra cost of removing the labels one by one will need to be borne by the brand owners who are placing these packs on the market. However, the challenges don't only exist in South Africa. This is the global view of what's happening today. Circularity is an international challenge, as we can see from these various headlines on the screen. Looking specifically at design for circularity, the legislation has outlined targets for inclusion of recycled content, including rPET, into packaging. If producers don't design products to be recycled, there will be a lack of rPET in the market, and producers will not be able to be compliant under the legislation. Here you can see that there's a target in year one for 10% of rPET inclusion, and this jumps to just 20%. This jumps to 20% in year 5, which is obviously a doubling of that amount. According to the legislation, producers must also conduct a life cycle assessment in relation to the identified product in accordance with the applicable standards within 5 years of implementation of their extended producer responsibility scheme, i.e. by November 2026. The life cycle assessment was focused on, firstly, minimization of material used in the identified product. Secondly, design of the product to facilitate reuse, recycling, or recovery without compromising the functionality of the product. And lastly, reduction of environmental toxicity of the resulting post-consumer waste stream. As mentioned in section 7.3 of the regulations, we also start to see the implementation of eco-modulation. Eco-modulation is the concept of penalizing the use of materials that are perceived to be environmentally harmful while rewarding the use of those which are perceived to be better for the environment, i.e. more recyclable. This means that individual costs per product won't be cross-subsidized. South African producers who do not adhere to design standards will be negatively affected by this part of the legislation. To end off, we know that it's hard to reverse the impacts of design decisions once they are implemented. We can't unscramble an omelette. Design decisions often lead to long-term investments that lock producers into a certain model for years to come. As Raju and Prabhu in their book Frugal Innovation argue, over 70% of the product's life cycle costs and environmental footprint is determined during its design phase. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I will now hand over to Stijn from MCC Label, who will be speaking about Project Grail. Over to you, Stijn.
Thank you, Cara. Very good morning from from my end. It's an absolute pleasure to be here and talk about Project Holy Grail. So today, I am not here as a representative of MCC Label, but I'm here representing the Holy Grail 2.0 initiative, which is led by AIM, the European Brands Association, and also supported by the Alliance to End Plastic Waste. And I think I wanted to give you a bit of an update on everything that is done in Europe, and also how this could be of interest to you in South Africa to help with this push for circularity. Maybe to start off, Cara already mentioned that legislation is a big push, and that's not much different in Europe. If you look at some of the targets that were set by the European Commission, that's mainly on reusable, recyclable, or compostable packaging. So by 2030, we need to make sure that everything that we put on the market that is plastic packaging needs to be in that category. But more importantly as well, we need to make sure that 55% of plastic packaging is effectively being recycled. For PET bottles or plastic beverage bottles, is even there's even a collection target there as well. So we need to make sure that whatever we're doing, we take into account circularity from the beginning point of all of this, especially when you have recycled content goals, which you also have. It's pretty clear that something needs to be done to move this into a positive direction. So how actually are we achieving this, or trying to achieve this with this group that came together? Is it has a very simple goal. We want to make sure that all the resources that we have available, the material that we have available, that we maximize everything that we can have in there. And that is in a very important first step, is to make sure that you can sort out correctly all the material. Think about the opportunities of having to be able to sort out PET food grade bottles versus non-food bottles, or having multi-layer that you can detect where it actually is coming from. And in a further extent, even making sure that you have a lot of data where it's coming from, who was the producer, and if you're doing well, that also you make sure that you have your EPR and all these different legislation coming into place correctly sorted out in there. So as that's the very general and short introduction, which I'm sure you're all very much aware of. One potential solution that came out of this is actually this project to use a digital watermark to make your packaging smart, and have actually a new way of sorting out materials. This opens, of course, a lot of new possibilities that is not possible with the current system in any country or any region. But we wanted to make sure this was a system that could be used wherever you want to use this. So I'll go a little bit more in detail later on, but the project itself started in 2020 and had the lovely name Holy Grail 2.0. And I put the website here as well if you want to have more information on this. But in September 2020, a lot of companies actually came together to prove the viability of a digital watermark for more accurate sorting in all of this. And of course, accurate sorting works on two aspects, the technical and the economical aspect. But that's something that this project wanted to see what the possibilities were for there in that stage. So if you're not familiar with Project Holy Grail, this was actually, so as the name it says, Holy Grail 2.0. This was this is the follow-up project of a study that was launched by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, a so-called pioneering project, Holy Grail. At the time, it was just called Holy Grail, not 1.0. But what was the intent of this project by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is actually to start screening and having a very thorough investigation of all the different innovations to improve post-consumer recycling. The most prominent ones there were digital watermarking, which I'll talk about in more detail later on, but also chemical tracers, other more AI-driven projects and so on, to actually see how can we develop something that works for the entire market, where we can really improve the sorting and later on that, of course, the recycling into more post-consumer recycled material as available in the market. This was a 3-year project. Out of this, digital watermarks came out as the most promising technology in all of this. Actually, it had a lot of good support with a large majority of everyone involved in this project, that it would be good to look at this more in detail and actually start investing in real life testing in this. And when I say we, actually the group started with 5 companies, of which we were a part of those 5 companies. But now it has grown quite exponential, and I'm very proud to share with you the next slide of our current membership list. As you can see, a whole lot of companies, going from brands to recyclers to equipment manufacturers, machine or also material producers are all involved in this, in making sure that we can prove the viability of this project and so on. And why are all these companies so interested or so willing to participate in all of this? Well, the project itself has a very clear and easy objective. It's proof that digital watermarking technology can be used for accurate sorting, but I think something that has always put a lot of emphasis on, and also in our communication, is the technical aspect in all of this. But as important as the technical viability of this original or this project, it's also the economic viability that is being tested on. So first stage project was, of course, focusing, does it work? Can we improve sorting on all of this? But it's very interesting if you have a very nice technology that nobody can afford, or the business case is not there. So we spend a lot of time and effort also with a lot of partners and even consulting groups in there to make sure that the existing business models that were present, any kind of barriers or cost improvements or cost deterioration that would be there is actually taking into account and making sure that not only technically but also economically this will work in the future in there. Now, maybe taking a small step back to all of this, what actually are digital watermarks? Well, if you look at this more in detail, digital watermark is a code that is imperceptible for the human eye, about the size of a postage stamp in there, that actually covers the entire surface of the packaging in there. It's able to, that code is able to carry a lot of information. So not only on the sorting, but also, even for consumer interaction, for improving of your supply chain or improving of your internal warehousing system, that same code can be used. But here, typically, it's used to have the information on who manufactured the product, what type of plastic is used. Multi-layer, that's also a clear focus of this project, to see how we can better sort out multi-layer projects that do not, in that case, hinder the final recycling. But I think the most interesting part is indeed to have a distinction between a food and non-food. Because if we want to go to a circular system, having the possibility to sort out non-food from food containers has a huge potential for, again, leading to a nicer and cleaner recycled material that comes out, has an option to get approved for a further food contact approval in there. So what you actually get is a product that looks very similar to what you see on the screen, but it will, in all other senses, actually behave like this, that you have a code that is completely over the packaging and gives you all that information in there. And how does it actually work? Well, if you look at this for this kind of packaging, so you have the code that is repeated as many times as possible. Why is that relevant in there? Well, if you have a traditional barcode, you need to have a certain angle with a scanner or something to see and get that information out. This was already improved with a QR code where the angle is not that relevant anymore, but you still needed to be able to scan the entire QR code in this. Well, in digital watermarking, actually the program or the software behind this can use a part of the tile, let's say in the top left corner, and combine this with something in the middle and with another one, and then come to the final conclusion of this. This is this kind of material from that manufacturer. Now, why is that relevant, especially in recycling? Well, packaging is hardly ever just the packaging that you produced yourself. So it's scratched, it's crumbled, it's not the same shape anymore. So if you have that option that it actually combines everything to one code, that's a huge advantage in all of this sense. And I need, of course, to add one section of this in terms of the label itself. This is not a layover, what we're doing. Actually, it's using the existing pixels of the market, no special inks, no special printing process, and rearranges the pixels, again, that it's not visible for the human eye, but it is visible for a camera system to detect those codes in there. Now, of course, that's a very nice solution if you have a labeled product in there, but what about if there is not a label present on the material, which of course, as a label manufacturer, I do not recommend, but it's always possible. We can also do a similar thing actually in the mold. And that's also been proven that you can make those codes used or put them in a mold and actually have them on your plastic product itself. This is a bit more visible to the human eye, but in certain cases where it is needed, it can be applied as well up there. So now knowing what digital watermarks are, if you look at the project itself, Holy Grail, this actually has three main focus areas, as you can see on the screen. First of all, we want to make sure that we have the so-called intelligent sorting, so that we can reject packaging that is not wanted in the recycling, but more importantly, add more packaging that would, in the case of, for instance, a shrink sleeve that is unwanted. In this case, you don't have to remove all the shrink sleeves. Now you can just take the ones out that really will hinder recycling, and the ones that are having a positive effect or are able to go to the recycling stream without any issues can be added to that stream. So that's a huge advantage. And then as well, of course, the dividing between food and non-food can give a lot of advantages there as well. Beside all of this, of course, there's a lot of data work that needs to be done and providing all of this. And of course, if you can share information with your consumer, that's a big advantage of all of this as well. And if you look at the entire packaging journey or packaging life for something, there are a lot of possibilities for digital watermarks. Here, the focus really is on what you see on the right of your screen, so the number 7, the recycling. But that same code can also be used throughout the entire lifespan of the product in there. So one example, which is I think a really fun, was the number 4, the checkout. By having digital watermarks into your product, you can actually have a faster scan or checkout procedure in the supermarket. And the unofficial world record of the fastest checkout in a supermarket, so the most products that were checked out in the least amount of time, has been done thanks to digital watermarking. And I highly recommend you to go on YouTube and have a look. And if you type in the fastest checkout in a supermarket in the world, you will come up with a solution that has digital watermarking in all of there. So this is, for me, the general introduction to all of this, but I'm sure you're very interested in where this project actually is. And I'll show you the overview of the project and where we stand now. So as been said, this project was started in September of 2020, where everything started to phase out of what we wanted to do. And in there, we actually divided this into 3 phases. You can see phase 1 starting in 2021, in beginning of the year, that's finalized toward the end of the year, where we had the project or the phase 2 starting out. And then earlier this month, or actually already the mid of last month, we started with phase 3 and all of this. And I'll walk you through the 3 phases, because I think it's important that you see what steps were taken in all of this, and how this is progressing step by step in there. So starting from the beginning, phase 1, this is really the prototype development in there. And what we wanted to do, and we were working there with several equipment manufacturers, is that we decided that this should be an add-on module for recycling facilities, so not a new line. No, it really has to be a combination with the existing near-infrared systems that are available on the market. So we worked with 2 partners in this, Pelank and Tomra, that worked with with Digimarc, who is the provider of the digital watermark technology, to actually make sure that we have an add-on prototype module that could work and see, okay, can it detect and sort out products of different sizes, different quality. So again, being crumpled down, or have some material that is that needs to have those different codes put together in there, and actually have this ready for a next step, which would be semi-industrial testing and all of this. And as you can, of course, or the reason why I'm here, we had that first product validated by Pelank and all of this, that we had our first prototype unit, which you can see here on the screen, that was developed and actually had extremely good results in there. So we did a series of testing in there, and we came up with a detection rate which was higher than 97%, and a correct ejection rate of 95% in all of this, which is an excellent result for having this add-on module. Of course, this was so-called lab scale at a lower speed, and with products that were added in there without the traditional dirty materials and so on. But you can see, as on the screen, that this was products that were crushed and not in the ideal situation in there. Now, an important part here is that we don't want to have this as a sole technology from one provider. So we worked with 2 machine manufacturers, as I already mentioned. So the one I showed you was from Pelank, but we also had we did the same work in parallel with Tomra working on this add-on module. And again, very happy to say that this gave exactly the same results. So a very high detection and ejection rate in all of these different products in there. So this was a very nice start of the project, where we know, okay, technically this works on small scale, and we can go forward in this, but we don't stop there, of course. So this moves into a second phase of the project, which was the semi-industrial testing in all of this. Why did we have to go to semi-industrial testing and all at once to industrial testing? Well, we wanted to make sure that this works with other materials as well. So not only material that has digital watermarking, and that the software and detection module are actually capable of doing this at higher speeds. So again, accuracy and detection and ejection rate are really key in here, but it's very, very important that this works at real life circumstances. So we selected 2 test locations for this, where each of the units were set. So we had one in Germany and one in Denmark. The one in Denmark was first ready, and actually we used this one in so-called open houses, and these open houses actually showed on a real life line that we had in Copenhagen with that unit, to people that wanted to have a look, this is how digital watermarking works. This is how it's combined, that people could feel and smell and have a good feeling of actually what came out of all this material in there. And that was a big success. So we had a lot of media there, a lot of partners there, a lot of interesting brands that wanted to take part in all of this. And the results of this test afterwards also were extremely good in there. So for this, we had different materials that we put in there, and we also put flexible packaging in there, which was a first there as well, which we had extremely good detection and ejection rates as well, and the purity of the product that came out was really impressive to have these kinds of results in there. So we were very happy with all these results that came out of this, and I think even more pleased we were with all of this is that the materials that we've done in Denmark could be replicated in our TOMRA detection unit as well. So both systems are fully capable of going to the semi-industrial speed, having more complex situations in all of this. So with the great work that was done by the technical team of Holy Grail, we can make those steps to actually go from a lab scale prototype equipment to the semi-industrial testing of all of this. Now, of course, this is all in a controlled environment, and I think, as Cara mentioned, we're also here to share things that went well and that we can bring out to other regions as well, like yourself. So for us, the last final version of this project was phase 3, full-scale validation. So industrial testing, making sure that this works. So those prototypes have been equipped in commercial sorting lines. Again, we used France and Germany for the locations of all of this. So in this case, if you have brand owners that are bringing this enhanced packaging with the digital watermark to the market, we could start seeing them getting into the recycling stream and seeing if we can split them out to make sure that this works in all the optimal conditions in there. So as we speak, you can buy products on the shelf in different European countries that have digitally watermarked packaging. Customers are not aware of this typically because, as I mentioned, these codes are imperceptible for the naked eye, but we do expect them to see more and more of this product coming into the waste facilities and seeing if we can separate them out in there. So at this stage, we have nearly, and the final numbers I got this morning were over 40,000 tons per year of enhanced materials. So as mentioned, we have several test markets, Denmark being one of them, and that material is being shipped to Germany for testing to have a bit of a higher concentration there, but also France and Germany are taking part in this project to make sure that they have all the materials in there. The plan now that we have in there is that, so we're gonna put some additional spiked material in there to see if we can further enhance all of this. So almost 380,000 bottles are gonna be put or produced and added in the real life circumstances, just to see if we can get the information a bit sooner, and while we bridge that wait period for customers to actually buy the products and all of this. And of course, this is a very key thing, and as I mentioned, in the food versus non-food in there. So we also have a first test plan for non-food RPET. Can we actually remove the HPC products, so the home care and personal care products out of this, your shampoo and so on? Can you get them out of the PET stream that would be intended for food in all of this as well? The partners who are taking part in this are mentioned below, but I'm sure that it's something that we'll be communicating more details on really quickly in there. Yeah, maybe just the partners that we have in there, so the recyclers. So just as very briefly, the German facilities that we have in there are focusing on PET, but we also have one specific example, the Borealis recycling facility, that is taking on rigid and flexible polyolefins, so both polyethylene and then polypropylene in all of this as well. And as I'm nearing to the end of my story, I do want to emphasize one thing, that is, of course, in terms of data, this is something that is completely integrated in what we already have. So GS1, the data provider you're all familiar with, is involved in this project to make sure that there's a lot of streamlining in all of this, and it's not a double work that needs to be done in all of this. And more important maybe for all of you is that the data protection and the data security is guaranteed in all of this, which is of course a very important part of this. And I think it also shows that a lot of this is collaboration. If we're going to circular economy and circular projects, it needs to be from all parts of the value chain. And that's why I want to end up with this slide, because I think it's important to show that this project is really carried by the entire value chain, going from brand manufacturers to recyclers to converters like ourselves, who are part of this, who needs to help with this entire story. And I think it fits nicely to the presentation that will come later on, is of course with EPR. We need to be very, very clear that this is something that is not standing next to it, but also combined in all the work that will be done in eco-modulation and further on in all of this. And as said, yeah, we're also part of this, and we're the partner that is helping out with ensuring that our friends from marketing like this product as well, and they don't even see it, but we still have the good results in all of this as well. And my final thing here is I wanted to say is that in terms of what this means for South Africa is that we strongly believe that if we finalize this this third phase of Holy Grail 2.0, is that we will be ready to actually export this to other countries and share the knowledge that we have done. So everything that worked out, but also what didn't work out, to see if we can implement these systems quicker throughout the world. And we'd be more than happy to bring you into contact for our Holy Grail 3.0 that we're preparing, that could develop this technology in other regions of the world as well. And with that, I'm going to hand that over to Kara. I know there are some Q&A at the end, but in case that we didn't get to it, you can always reach out to me directly, and I'm more than happy to address any questions there. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Stijn. It's so interesting and so exciting to know that we are on the map to potentially be involved. So yeah, thank you for your time. I see there is one question in the Q&A, but we will get to that at the end. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Marco, please.
So good morning. It's a pleasure to be here and to give you a brief update on tethered closures. So I will cover the following sessions. I will give a brief update on legislation, where we stand and what we see happening around the globe. Also talk about tethered closures not only as something that is driven through legislation in Europe, but we see that more as a global opportunity. And then I'll go into the different innovations that we have developed at Husky for tethered closures on the plastic part. And the final part is how we help the industry basically in going to tethered by minimizing the investment that are required. So on the legislation, you probably know that the tethered closures has been started in Europe. Europe had started back in March of 19. So releasing the legislation on single-use plastics that covered many items from cutlery over fishing gear, straws, and so on, where certain of these items get banned, others get requirements on minimum levels of recycled materials. And tethered closures basically is the intent to maximize recycling of the total package, so the bottle and the closure. So we see this kind of trend also in other parts of the world. So in the US, so California has already made suggestions for similar legislation. In Canada, single-use plastics are also being, so certain items are being banned, others are getting additional requirements in terms of recycling. Same happens in Australia as well. In Chile recently, also their legislation has been voted that prohibits styrofoam, takeaway containers, cups and cutlery. So basically the trend is that there is more and more discussions along the lines to repeat what is happening in Europe. So we think that this might get some momentum in other parts of the world as soon as this is implemented in Europe. So in Europe, there is a standard that has been created through the European Committee for Standardization. And basically it has two main criteria to define what it means that a closure stays attached to a bottle. Because as we know, the plastic cap, if you want to remove it from the bottle, you will always be able to do so, because plastic has limited mechanical resistance. So how it has been defined is that the closure, if it is used as it's intended, should be able to withstand 15 opening closing cycles. And in a way to assess the strength of the link between the closure and the bottle, it has been defined that for PET bottles, that link need to be able to resist a pull force of 25 newtons in two directions, one in the axis of the bottle and the other 90 degrees from there. So as I said, this is the legislative push in Europe, but we see that more as a global opportunity because tethered closures allow to convey a message of sustainability. Sustainability is gaining in importance in our society, and all the brands are basically putting also more efforts into sustainability. Second is, as these closures are significantly different from the current closures, they are a nice ways to differentiate and also give a view of premiumization. So feedback that we get is in countries where this is not pushed through legislations, brands and consumers see this other benefits like the closure cannot be lost, it's not falling on the floor, so there is more hygiene. So that there is a way to see this tethered closure also a way as to differentiate and premiumize your brand. And the third one is it allows for storytelling, meaning that the brand is bringing something new on the market, and this allows basically to do some advertising on that and bring some focus to the brand. So if you look at active or completed projects, we have projects in 13 countries, and 56 of those projects are happening outside of Europe, as you can see on this land, on this global map. And in terms of opportunities, we see there also a gain in momentum. If you look at the pipeline of opportunities that we're discussing 3,200 cavities. And also here, we see that 58% are outside of Europe. And as you can see on the map, there are also discussions ongoing with certain brands in South Africa. So actually, the first system that we sold for tethered closures is not for Europe. It is going to a customer in the Philippines, to Philippine Springwater. And it is interesting to basically hear what the president was saying. He was saying that they are a very a company that is really focused on innovation and quality, and for them, basically making sure that the consumer experience is considered and that is a positive one is a critical design input. So you will see that this comforted us in the approach that we took to develop our tethered closures. And he was saying the success of these tethered initiatives, if it's not pushed through the legislation, really depends on delivering to the consumer an experience that is really optimal. So I say that we were comforted in our approach is that when we started developing these tethered closures, we really looked at the total life cycle of that closure. So from the first site on the shelf until, so through opening the closures, the experience of securing it, does it stay in the position? How is it during drinking and pouring experience? How easy is it to reclose that closure and reopen it again? And does it really withstand the requirements so that it will remain attached to the bottle until the recycling step? So in terms of innovations, we have evaluated many concepts, as you can see here. And we went through also in-house testing, consumer testing on evaluating the intuitiveness of all those different designs. So we landed on basically a design, as you can see here, that is composed of always the same elements. There will be two arms, there will be a flap on the band, and there will be a hook on the closure shell that will allow basically the closure to open up at 100 degrees when this protrusion is existing. And this depends on the geometry of the thread. It is a ratio of diameter to height of the neck, and also very important, the size of that support ring. However, what we always achieve with our designs is that the closures will not heat the face of the consumer when they drink from the bottle, and they will not stand in the way of pouring. The use of those closures, we try to be as intuitive as possible, and when you use those closures, you always get tactile and audible cues if the closure has reached its final position. And we think that through the design that we are selected, we are able to really provide superior value and thus differentiate the brands. So here you see the opening of 2622, which basically is the new finish that is planned to be replacing the 881. Here, the design is slightly different due to the support latch size that has been selected for this neck. But also here you see that the use is very intuitive, very easy. The closure remains open as intended and recloses very, very easily. So why is that? So we believe that through injection molding, we have certain benefits over other technologies like slitting, because it allows us to realize very complex geometries when needed, as you can see on this picture. And these geometries are not easily possible, if at all, with slitting technologies. And basically this allows us to reach the 180 degrees opening using that protrusion on all standard neck finishes. And through the fact that these are molded directly during the ejection process, the closure comes out of the mold ready to be used without any additional secondary step is required. The fact that it is molded also allows us to play with radii, with the length of the different elements, to basically fine-tune the consumer experience, whether you want something that is more reactive, less reactive, more difficult, or less difficult to open. So a high degree of design freedom. The second stage of the use of tethered closure, and this is probably the most complicated or challenging for consumers, is the reclosing. As now the closure is attached to the bottle, it limits the play that you have to reclose it. And this is particularly sensitive on water closures, where the plug seal needs to be a little bit longer to guarantee function. This is called break then leak. Actually, what you want is that when you open the bottle, all the bridges that connect the closure to the temporary evidence band are broken before you have a breakage of the sealing. So due to that, you have plug seals that are a little bit longer on water closures. And what happens is that when you reclose those kind of closures, you will find out that there is an interference between the plug seal and the thread finish. As you can see in this see-through animations, once you reclose it, you see that there is an interference between that plug seal and the closure, and the consumer basically needs to manipulate the closure, lift it up before he can reclose it. So to overcome that and to make the reclosing very intuitive, what we have added is a cam inside that basically guides that closure into its final position when you reclose it. So it is a very simple one-finger reclosing that allows the consumer to place the closure very easily in final position and reclose it without any difficulty. So this is another example of how we have really kept the consumer experience in mind while developing these closures, and have included these features to maximize positive consumer experience. So this is the feature that we call the reclosing feature, and as well as this reclosing feature as our tethering system, are patented solutions that we basically provide to our customers without any license fee if they buy their tooling from us. So we were discussing the different phases of the closure. We discussed already 3 of them, from consumer experience over the intuitiveness of the operations and the brand appeal. But the other things that are important about the closure is that obviously you want to minimize the amount of plastic that is used. So we always keep weight top of our mind. The performance of these closures need to be as good or better as the non-tethered versions. We don't want to have any negative impact during the capping process. And obviously for converters, we also looked at ways to minimize the conversion effort. So here I'm just showing what we call the waste wheel. So when we developed the tethered closures, what we did is we dissected the closure in its different components, and we have invested heavily into simulation software and capabilities in order to validate what implications it would have to remove weight in certain areas. So we took the example here of an 1881 closure non-tethered that we have in our portfolio for the Coca-Cola. And when we developed the 1881 for Coke in the tethered versions, we were able to basically remove weight from areas where we probably had over-engineered the closure, and basically come to a tethered version of an 1881. So with added functionalities, with a weight which is reduced by 0.2 compared to the historical Coke closure in non-tethered version. So how does our development process look like? So we always start in the virtual environment. What that means is that you would start with what are the neck and closure specifications required. We would then design the closure, and as Husky is providing preforms and closures, we are also able to design non-standard neck finishes and closures. We would then design the dispensing system. And then we go into simulation work. So we simulate everything from the injection perspective. So whether it's the ejection profile, the temperatures at exit of the mold, the ejection of that closure, the post-mold cooling. So basically we do all that to make sure that the closure, when it gets out of the mold, has the geometry as we have it per design intent to be able to meet with all the requirements on the plastic part. The second phase, we validate then that the plastic part that is being molded with the given geometry will withstand all the performance requirements, whether that is opening forces, venting performances, sealing performances. All of that is simulated. And we do as many loops as needed in the virtual environment so that we are happy with the outcome before we go in the real life physical environment, which is then we build a pilot mold. So we're using 1 to 4 cavity molds. Inject that, we validate the injection process, we validate that actually the geometry that is molded is meeting the design intent through scanning. So we have 3D scanning of the plastic part. We do all the validation in our brand approved labs, and finally we go into a line and validate the closure on industrial line. If at any point there is a refinement required, we reinitiate through an FEA to validate the modifications required, and the loop continues on. Also very important when you go with tethered is to verify the implication it has downstream. So we try to minimize those, and for all the systems we have shipped so far, and the line trots have done with pilot phases, the only modification that was required was minor adjustments on the line. whether that is the guiding rails or the sorting, or changing chucks. So the change of chucks is something that is very common in the industry. As soon as you change the closure provider, those have slightly different dimensions, and if you want to maintain efficiency, you often need to change the chuck. And also here we have developed capabilities to provide chucks if needed. So with that, basically, what I'm trying to say is that when we develop tethered closures, and this is as important for Europe as outside of Europe, we put a lot of focus on the consumer experience, but also on the efficiency for the producer, which means minimizing the waste in the closure, validating through flow and mechanical simulation, so that we can manufacture and test, minimizing the number of iterations required, and then guaranteeing the speed to market right the first time. As I mentioned, for converters, specifically in Europe, where this is driven by legislation, the change to tethered closures comes with a requirement in investment. And this is particularly important for converters that are providing for different brands. So we developed our closures. We also kept flexibility in mind. And basically what you can see in this slide is, if we start with NAIN 81 base, that here in blue, signalizing that we developed that for Pepsi. If we want to go with a Nestle closure, which has slightly different criteria, we would change just certain parts in the mold. So in this case, it would be the inner core and the outer core, which would then allow the converter to go from a Pepsi closure to a Nestle closure. And if he wants then to provide closures for Coke, that would be also here changes of a slightly different set of items in the mold, slides, outer cores, and cavities. And with a simple change of cavities, it would go from a flex grip design to an 100 ml design, which both of them are used by the Coca-Cola company. And if you look at the GME 3040, which is the new neck finish for CSD that has been developed in collaboration with Coke. Also here, we start with a Coca-Cola closure, swapping certain components. We get a Pepsi validated closure. And just with the change of slides, we can go from one with protrusion to one without protrusion. And with the change of cavities, we can go to a light version of that closure that goes from 1.85 to 1.7 gram. And why would we do that? Well, that neck finish here has been developed to withstand very high carbonation levels, up to 5.2. If that is not needed, we could shave off 0.15 gram of that closure, just simply swapping cavities. So here's another illustration of how we kept also the investment requirements from converters in mind when developing our portfolio of solutions. I'm mentioning down here Tethered Ready. What is that? So we'll show how that works in this next slide. But here the idea is that for certain brands that are considering moving from 1881 to 3040, they might not want to do 2 steps at a time, where basically would go with a new neck finish and tethered closures. There might be potentially too risky for them. So what we have here is we have what we call Tethered Ready. What that means is that you would buy a mold that is with a non-tethered closure, where we're just swapping slides, which is the easiest component to swap on a mold. Even with the mold staying on the machine, you could go from tethered to from non-tethered to tethered, or vice versa. So how does that work? You can see here this illustration. We are injecting, in this case, a tethered closure. You see that the temper evidence band is done by this component, the slide, and the whole tethering mechanism is molded with the slide only. So everything is in that part. So you see here the temper evidence band, and that the whole tethering feature is within this slide. And you operate the tethered closure. So now imagine that we just mirror this slide with the same geometry as that side, so without the tethering mechanism in it. So now you inject that closure, and as it comes off, obviously the band has no tethering mechanism in it anymore. And when you open it, all the bridges break, and you have a very standard closure. So if you know upfront that potentially at one moment in time you want to go to tethered closures, This technology here allows you to be tether ready. So start with a non-tethered closure, and then swapping slides, you could go with a non-tethered closure. So here, this slide here just shows our current portfolio of tethered solutions in the three main segments. Water, so you have SNAP solutions that you might know from Europe, and then solution for 2925 and 3025. So as I said, we are always developing closures that are very competitive in terms of weights and that are validated by big brands. In CSD, we have solutions for the two main neck finishes, 1881 and 26 millimeter, GME 3040, or even the lighter version, GME 3037. And we also have a solution in 38 millimeter neck finishes. And the portfolio is always expanding, so we are now adding versions without that protrusion that are also opening at 180 degrees, and a series of closures for Coca-Cola, and a no protrusion version for 38 millimeter. Also here, they will all be based on standard neck finishes approved by CT and with brand level performances. What is also interesting potentially to mention here is that we see also tethering going into adjacent markets. So in Europe, you need to know that also HDPE bottles and pouch fitments, carton packs, all of these single-use packages need to have tethered solutions. So we have been developing also solutions for these packages. So what we see on the top here is a tethered closure for an HDPE bottle. And as I said, here the advantage of Husky is that we design necks and closures. So here what we did is we slightly modified the HDPE bottle, adding an additional ring here. So the ring typically does not exist on these packages. And we basically just added our temp evidence band on the closure from the customer. That was the only change required with the add of this ring on the HDPE bottle, and we had functioning closures at the second injection in our piloting lab. This was a concept with a single leash, where basically the closure is free to move on this bottle. Is basically an easier solution. By the end of the day, the customer also in this case selected in a premium tether version. Then we also developed solutions for pouches, as you can see on these pictures here. So these are actuals from our pilot mold, and we also have piloted carton closure concept. Well, so here it's always a collaboration with the customer, where basically the functionality of the closure we don't touch that. We only come and replace the temp evidence band, modify that together with the customer to add our tethering features. So in short, basically a value proposition for tethered, and why this is also interesting in areas outside of Europe where it's pushed by legislation, is that it provides a nice consumer experience with a 180 degrees opening and locking experience. The operations, we did everything possible to make it as intuitive as possible. With the example as I showed with the reclosing feature, it allows to hand the brands. So especially when you implement this where it's not being pushed by legislation. And as I said, we have a lot of activity in Southeast Asia, in Africa, and in the US. We have solutions that are weight neutral. They comply with what we know today from the European legislation. The performance is not impacted. What is nice is that when you go with an injected closure, you have a certain design freedom, but as important, as soon as the closure falls off the injection mold, it's ready to be used without any additional step required. So as I said, we see a lot of interest from our customers, but also we get contacts from brands and resin suppliers from every part of the world. And with this, I end the presentation, and I'm very happy to get any question and reply to any questions you might have. And if you have any questions beyond, Kara has my contact details, then can provide that to you after this presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Marco. Very interesting. My My mouth was hanging open at the technology that goes into, making sure that it recloses properly. All these little things that just seem to happen behind the scenes. It's quite amazing. So thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Mike.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak here today. I'm afraid not as much technology in my presentation, but hopefully still interesting, but in a different way. So yeah, I'm just going to be covering today some of the activity in Europe around recyclability and recycled content, and also some of the certification systems for those which are starting to be developed. So I'm just going to do a one-slide introduction to Epro, because I'm aware that perhaps not everyone is familiar with Epro, but Epro is the European Association of Plastics Recycling and Recovery Organisations. And the members of Epro are normally fall into one of three categories. So either PROs, operating under EPR legislation, product stewardship, or materials organisations responsible for collecting plastic and sorting and recycling it, or technical plastics organisations. Our members at the moment are focused either on packaging or agricultural plastics, or both, and the packaging splits into household and commercial and industrial. We have 23 members. Most are in Europe, but you can see that we also have some members now outside of Europe. So in Canada, we have 2 members, in South Africa, of course, Petco, and in New Zealand as well. And the objective is really to optimize national effectiveness through international cooperation and exchange of best practice, something that Cara mentioned right at the beginning of the webinar this morning. And we have a range of different working groups to kind of facilitate that exchange of best practice, and also we're involved in quite a few different external activities, primarily within Europe, such as EU Circuplast, which is certification of recyclers, EPBP, which I'll touch on later, Circular Plastic Alliance, and PSET, which is a circular economy platform for polyolefin plastics. So there you see our members in Europe, so members in most of the certainly Western European countries, and outside of Europe. You'll see Petco there in South Africa, and those ones in Canada and New Zealand. Right, so jumping into the topic for this morning for me, I thought I'd start with some of the policy and legislation, because in Europe that's really what's driven recycling since really the early 90s. So in terms of policy, we had something in 2015 called the Action Plan for a Circular Economy. Now, it covers a lot of different things, but what I've just done is pulled out the ones relevant to recyclability and recycled content. So it has a stated objective of encouraging recycled content. For waste management, it starts to change the idea from just collecting as much as possible to actually making sure it's presented to recyclers in a quality which is usable to go into those higher quality applications, such as packaging. Eco-design is mentioned, quality standards for baled material, and plastics. The policy covers all different materials, but plastics is a particular focus area. And because of that focus area in plastics, we then had something called the European Strategy of Plastics in a Circular Economy, which followed. And that gave various policy aspirations, so that by 2030, all packaging placed on the European market is either recyclable or reusable. That more than half of the plastics in Europe are recycled by 2030. It also had a 10 million ton recycled content target. So that's 10 million tons of recycled polymer in products going onto the European market. Eco-design was mentioned again. And then the latest one was the Circular Economy Action Plan 2, as it tends to be known, in 2020, which talks about a well-functioning market for secondary raw materials. This is basically the free flow of materials around Europe, so they can move from sorting to recycling and recycling to manufacturing, increasing recycled content. And this concept of high quality recycling, which is yet to be defined in Europe, but there's actually some work going on at the moment to try and define what we mean by high quality recycling. So if we move to the policy, from the policy to the legislation, you'll see that it pretty much mirrors the policy objectives. So in 2018, we had a revision to our main framework legislation for waste. And in there you have something called Article 8A, which is for EPR schemes, and it really sets a range of mandatory requirements for them to meet. One of those is covering the full net cost of collection, sorting and recycling. But in terms of today's discussion, another interesting one was the use of fee modulation to reflect design characteristics and general environmental performance. So that sometimes covers recycled content as well. Then we have the Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive, revised a number of times and currently being revised again at the moment. But there was a big increase in 2018 in the target that has to be met for plastic packaging recycling in Europe, 50% by 2025, 55% by 2030. Interestingly, at the same time, in another piece of legislation, it changed the measurement point. So the measurement point now in Europe is just prior to the extruder. Previously, most people were measuring by the bale weight going into the recycler. And for those of you that are familiar with the recycling processes, you'll know that certainly for household materials, there's quite a difference between those two measurement points. And the revision that's ongoing at the moment, I'm going to touch on the next slide. And finally, here we have the Single-Use Plastics Directive. This is the first piece of legislation in Europe where there is a mandatory recycled content target. It also has a collection target specifically for beverage bottles, but it also has that first mandatory recycled content target, and that's 25% recycled content for PET beverage bottles by 2025. And by 2030, that expands to include any type of beverage bottle, whatever material it's manufactured from, and it increases to a 30% target. How these targets are set, I would suggest is pretty important, whether or not it's on a sectoral level or a brand owner level or a country level. This particular one is on a country level. So I should flag again that this slide is covering a revision which is ongoing. We're expecting a first draft of the revision in, well, actually the 30th of November to be precise. And it will then take about another 2 years approximately to actually come into force. So everything you see on this slide is subject to change, but it's a process that's been going on for a couple of years. And so we're starting to get quite a good idea of what's in there. Certainly before it goes to the European Parliament, where there's potential for some changes. So the Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive, what we're expecting is mandatory recycled contents targets for all plastics packaging. So not just beverage bottles, all plastics packaging. So that would be films, bottles, pots, trays, etc., etc. And the current aspirations to actually have that split into what they call a contact sensitive recycled content target and a non-content sensitive target. So contact sensitive target primarily is recycled content in applications which are used for holding food or drinks, but it might also be for cosmetics, for example, would be another example of a contact sensitive application. What we're expecting is a definition of what recyclable is, which is a topic I'll come on to in a moment. And also we're expecting that there'll be different recyclability classes. Something else that, again, I'll mention in terms of some of the certification schemes currently out there in the market. Often this is used. We don't know what they will be called, these different classes, but for example, it might be a class A, a class B, a class C, with, for example, the class A being the most recyclable. The third bullet point is perhaps the most important one in that it says that all plastic packaging placed on the market by 2030 must be recyclable. So what that definition of recyclable is clearly very important. And this is a target which would apply to anyone placing packaging on the market in Europe. As, by the way, with the recycled content targets, the current expectation is that they will be placed on those placing the packaging onto the market rather than at a country level, which obviously makes it more difficult perhaps for those packaging producers or those placing packaging on the market that are primarily food applications, for example. We're also expecting various lists of items which are deemed unrecyclable or unnecessary. And the idea of these lists, I would suggest, is really to get something to happen quickly and before 2030. So anything we know to be problematic in the recycling supply chain might be targeted in these lists to stop them sooner than 2030. Also some stuff in there on composting and biodegradable. I think that's relevant in this conversation, in the sense that obviously those items, what's very useful can obviously, if they're used in products which flow into the traditional plastics recycling chain, cause problems. I'm not going into detail just for the purposes of time now, but we also have another revision of the Waste Framework Directive, and again, stimulating the use of secondary materials, and so recycled content is going to be covered there. So, design for recyclability. First of all, what are the drivers in Europe? Well, the first one would be to ensure that all packaging can be sorted and recycled at the end of its life. That's important from a CSR perspective, I think increasingly I'd suggest, with brand owners, and also from a legislation perspective. Also to ensure that that packaging is not disruptive in the supply chain. And I've put here both for sorting and recycling. Quite often people talk about recycling, but clearly if something causes a problem in the sorting element of the supply chain, or it's not sortable, not identifiable, such as a carbon black product, then of course it doesn't get recycled because it doesn't reach recycler. So both are equally important. A desire to use recycled content back into packaging, and also the packaging targets of 50%. Well, clearly, if it's not recyclable, that makes your challenge of meeting a 50% recycling rate for all packaging placed on the market more difficult. And clearly, if it's not recyclable, you can't recycle it into something that can be used again. So it makes those recycled contents targets more difficult. So now on to the million-dollar question, perhaps, and one which has had a lot of focus in Europe in terms of how do we define recyclability? And actually, I would add, how do you define it in legislation? Because those of us involved on a day-to-day business, and I'm sure many of you are in the webinar today, will know that things are changing all of the time. Packaging design is changing, recycling capabilities and sorting capabilities are changing. And so how do you define something that's recyclable, at the same time have it flexible so that those rules can be adjusted over time as the markets change? And that's difficult when you have legislation which might take 1, 2, or even more years to revise. So in terms of the actual definition itself, I have to say we don't know, because it's going to be in the legislation. But what I can tell you is that these discussions coming from the Commission and in working groups that have taken place in Europe tend to split the definition into two parts. One is that it's technically recyclable, but the second, and perhaps most important, is that in practice it's recyclable. So what's likely to come out is that it's not good enough just to say that your product is technically recyclable in a laboratory or a small scale pilot lab, but actually there's enough sorting capacity and recycling capacity within Europe to actually process it in practice. So it's recyclable in practice as well as theoretically. Now, of course, we don't know what numbers might come out in terms of allocating, for example, the amount of countries that it has to be collected in a particular item, or how much sorting capacity there needs to be. We'll have to wait and see. Some of the numbers that have been talked about are around the 30% mark in terms of the actual recycling of a particular product to demonstrate that it's recyclable, but we'll see what the draft says. So what about assessing recyclability? Well, at the moment, people are trying to assess recyclability prior to the legislation coming in. And there are a wide range of different schemes now in Europe in terms of assessing recyclability. Some are European-wide schemes. Some operate at a national level, some are covering all plastic packaging types, and others are more focused. Some offer certification, where it will provide a certificate to say, your packaging achieves a certain level of recyclability. Others provide online tools where you can check your packaging against the criteria, and it will give you an answer. So it's slightly different than the certification, but you can self-check. Others are simpler and just provide guidance to manufacturers. As I said earlier, often it's not a question of it is or it isn't recyclable. There tend to be different classes. And I'll come on to that in a moment. And more generally, I'd say there are ambitions to have more standardization in Europe, because we have 27 countries within the European Union, and we obviously have other countries which are closely linked and operate with Europe, the UK, Norway, Switzerland. And so there is an aim to have more standardization. And so in Europe, we have something called the Circular Plastics Alliance, which involves producers, converters, waste management companies, recyclers, and associations such as Epro. And one of the things it's looking at is standardization of design for recycling. So perhaps that will feed in, at least in terms of a content level, to some of the discussions happening at Europe, but there isn't a direct link between the two activities. And then, as I've mentioned, at a legal level, we're expecting a definition of recycling in the legislation, but also we're expecting technical annexes, which will perhaps give some more details in terms of assessing that recyclability. What I've done here is just give you some examples of design guidelines. It's certainly not all of the design guidelines which are available within Europe, but I would say it's probably some of the better known ones are here. And I've also tried to give a flavour for the fact that some of the points in the previous slide that they don't necessarily cover all different plastic types or have the same geographical scope. So EPBP, I mentioned, if you remember on the first slide, that this is something that Epro are involved with. So this is European PET bottle platform. This was one of the first systems in Europe to look at recyclability, and specifically it looks at the recyclability of PET bottles, as the name suggests. Recyclas is a system set up by the plastics recyclers within Europe, and that looks at most of the plastic packaging types, the exceptions being the PET bottles, which are handled by the EPBP, and also PET trays, which are handled by the Trade Association for PET in Europe, ECO. CFlex is a platform looking at increasing the recyclability of household flexible packaging, all flexible packaging, but in this instance, particularly talking about plastic. And then we have some country-specific ones. So we have KIDV in the Netherlands, which are an organisation giving advice to industry on design for recycling. And we have Cotrep in France, a similar type of organisation giving information and advice to manufacturers. In the Netherlands, they cover both rigid and flexible packaging. And in France, I've listed it there, you can read it, they cover most different types of plastic packaging, both bottles, pots, tubs, trays, flexible packaging as well. And if you look at the column that says evaluation mechanism, you'll see that typically there is some sort of level of grading. So for example, Recyclas have an A to F categorization, A being the very best recyclable material, items I should say, because they would be considering a packaging item. And they consider that below C it's not recyclable. Others are more descriptive. So you have, for example, reasonably recyclable, limited recyclable, not recyclable, etc., etc. And then on the right, you can see that there are a range of different mechanisms. Most common is just to provide guidelines. Second to that would be an online tool, and third would be a certification in terms of how often you see those different approaches. And several of the schemes here use a combination of those. Now, what I've tried to do, I'll try and do very quickly here, just in the next few slides, is look at how this recyclability and design for recycling is being implemented in practice in the EPR systems and the PROs within Europe. As I mentioned in the legislation, it's a requirement now to use fee modulation, or at least more specifically, it will be by the 5th of January next year. And it's still very much in development in Europe, but what I'll try and do is give you a flavour for how it's used. So if you look at this slide here, first of all, you'll see different packaging items on the left. You'll then see different countries listed across the top. And the far right column is the average fee you would pay within those countries for placing that item on the market. So the average fee you would pay to the PRO. It's not weighted in any way. All I've done is taken the different figures from the different countries and divided it by the number of countries, but just to give an indication. And then you'll see different colours, some light colours, some darker colours. The darker the colour, the higher the difference between the lowest and the highest fees within that country. So if I take Belgium as a particular example, you can see a lot of dark colours. So what that's signifying is the difference between the lowest cost fee that you have, which is for a PET clear bottle, and the highest cost fee that you have, which is for a flexible pouch with an aluminium layer, is significant. Where you see less changes in colour, in the shading, there's less difference between the highest and the lowest fees. But what I wanted to point out here is how that design for recycling is coming in. So if you look at the fees here, the lower end of the fee range, what that typically relates to, the differences between them, is more to do with the actual cost of collecting, sorting and recycling the product. So some products have a very good market value when you sell them, others you have to pay a gate fee, some are more costly to sort, etc., etc. So these tend to reflect those differences in the costs. So not so much about design, more about the cost. When you get into these higher fees, what you start to see is that eco-modulation really coming in. So this is where you're seeing the PROs either rewarding the producers and those placing packaging on the market for what they deem good design, or penalising them for what they see as poor design or something that needs to be changed. So again, you can see the higher fees are for those more complex packaging items, such as multi-layer films, such as pouches. You can see there a black tray I mentioned earlier. If it's using carbon black, then it can't be identified, therefore can't be recycled. So these sorts of factors come in. Very, very quickly, I've said that this presentation could be circulated afterwards if people want to look at the detail, but I'll just spin through it very quickly. In Italy, the eco-modulation is mainly focused on how established the sorting and recycling supply chain is. In Belgium, it's very, very granular and per product type, and that's overlaid with design criteria. In France, again, there's a very granular system of bonuses and penalties, both covering design for recycling and the use of recycled content. And in the Netherlands and Sweden, they have quite complex design criteria, but it's a pass or fail in terms of whether or not you would get the lower rate of the fee. Just some caveats. As I mentioned earlier, the shading doesn't mean expensive in itself. It means difference between the lowest and the highest fee. So if you see a lot of, so for example, if I take Belgium, it has some dark colouring, but actually it has some of the lowest fees for things like PET bottles. So it's just that the difference is bigger. And also, I've been simple in terms of the information, in the sense that you can change the grading depending on the exact detail of the product structure. And finally, I should have mentioned, I keep saying but this is actually something that was done by Epro, and I was working with Epro on it with a different hat. So it was some work that was done by Epro, which is the Association for EPR schemes in Europe, but they also have members outside of Europe. So moving on to design for recycled content. So historically, this has been done to reduce cost. People have bought recycled material because it's been cheaper than virgin material, and that's been, if we look at the last 20 years, that's kind of been where it's fitted in. That's changed in the last decade. Primarily, I would suggest, driven by companies' CSR strategies, many related to PET beverage bottles, as those brand owners try and use recycled content. And we also now have those legal targets coming in that I've talked about. But we also have in Europe plastics taxes coming in. And there's not time to go into the detail of those, but we have one now operational in the UK, and they're due to be operational in Spain and Italy in 2023. And simplistically, the lower the recycled content level you have, the higher fees that you pay. That's certainly the case in Spain and Italy, and in the UK, it's a slightly different system where they have a de minimis. You have to hit 30%. If you hit 30% recycled content, you don't pay the fee, and you avoid the tax altogether. And EPR bonuses and fee modulation, increasingly we've seen this, and they can be quite large. They can be 400, even 500 euros per tonne bonuses in some countries now, particularly in France, for the uses of certain types of recycled content in certain products. And what exactly the bonus is does depend on those different variables. So key challenges and considerations for recycled content. Top of the list probably has to be food contact compliance. PET is well established in this area in terms of producing material that can be used back into beverage bottles. Other packaging sectors, it's more challenging, in particular polyolefins, where they're slightly more absorbent to contaminants. And so there are certainly more challenges there in terms of using polyolefins back in food contact applications. What counts as recycled content? Is it just post-consumer? Is it pre-consumer? And actually, most importantly, most of the discussion is how you define the two, or more specifically, how you define the difference between a pre-consumer waste and something that might not be a waste in the first place and might just be production scrap. What counts as recycled content in chemical recycling? Huge area of discussion in Europe. Chemical recycling at the moment is still relatively embryonic in terms of capacity at a commercial scale, but there's a huge amount of activity and an expectation that there will be hundreds of thousands of tons of capacity sometime between 2025 and 2030. So how you define recycling, but in particular for the purposes of today's discussion, how you define recycled content is a big discussion, and I'll touch on that in a moment. And also how you align the supply chain to produce the right volumes and the right quality. If I take plastic films as an example here, if you look at household films, you have polyethylene films, you have polypropylene films, you have multi-layer films, you have films with plastic and PET and PP, quite complex mixtures. And if you're making an intrusion product, such as a board or a bench, to a degree, you can cope with those contaminants. But if you're trying to make a film product again, to put recycled content back into a film, then clearly the specification that you're aiming for is a lot higher. And so to achieve the goal of putting recycled content back into packaging, it's not just looking at the recycling, it's looking all the way along the supply chain. It's about design, it's about how you sort and how you grade, and also how you recycle. All are important. And I think understanding the potential impact on other targets and also the infrastructure, these are other big discussions. So the balance between meeting an overall recycling target and recycled content, and also the infrastructure that you need. Do you need more chemical recycling? How much mechanical recycling do you need to try and hit targets in different applications? Not time to go into a huge amount of detail, maybe a discussion for another day, but this is a typical pyrolysis recycling, chemical recycling supply chain. So this is something that might be used for PPs, HDs, LDP films in terms of chemical recycling. The point I just wanted to highlight here is it's a complex supply chain, and you lose the identity of the material through the supply chain. So you have a chemical recycling process here, but then it's what comes out is a hydrocarbon oil, and then it can be purified, and then it goes into a cracker. And what comes out of a cracker can vary. Some of it is monomer, which you'll use back into plastic. Some of it is a chemical product, and some of it is fuel. And another big discussion in Europe at the moment is what counts as recycling here. If you put 1 ton in at the beginning, how much of that 1 ton can you count as recycling, and how much can you count as recycled content? Some of the plastic is used to power the process, typically here, so you lose some plastic there. There might be fuel outputs, and under the European definition, if your product is used in a fuel application, it doesn't count as recycling, so probably that has to be discounted. And do you count the chemical products here? It would count as recycling under the European definition, but it doesn't actually go back into plastic. So if you're talking about recycled content, can you count this tonnage here? So these are very active conversations in Europe. So I can't give you the answer to the question, but we should start to see better visibility of what the likely outcome is going to be towards the end of this year, because there's work actively being done on this within the Commission and within the Commission's technical wings, departments. Certification schemes for recycled content, there are a large number in Europe. Most are operating at a national level, but here are 3 European-wide or international ones. One is Polycert, not specifically a certification scheme in its own right, but what it aims to do is to standardize the different certification schemes. So it basically says that if you meet these certain criteria, you can join under the umbrella of Polycert. So there are a number of schemes that sit beneath it. Recyclas, I've mentioned in respect to recyclability, they also have a recycled content scheme. that concentrates on physical traceability, so mechanical recycling, where you absolutely know or you can calculate what recycled content there is. And something called ISCC, they're involved in a lot of certifications, but they have them now for recycled content. One is a physical segregation, so again, that's mechanical recycling, for example, and one is that mass flow, that chemical recycling scenario I just showed you. So this is the main one that's used by chemical recyclers, in the sense that it actually allows you to free allocate recycled content that might be in a fuel output, for example, which obviously doesn't go to plastic, and free allocate that in a theoretical way to the monomer stream. So, in summary, major topics within Europe at the moment. Spend a lot of time speaking about it, as do many of the people involved in associations and working with the Commission, giving input. Many complexities and challenges for the whole supply chain and policy makers. And I've just summarised them just to finish off. Just some examples. We could list more, but from a brand owner's perspective, that balance of trying to get the packaging to do what it's there for, to meet the functionality, but also get it so it's recyclable. And that's particularly challenging, for example, in some flexible film applications. Also, brand owners want to see harmonization. What they don't want to see is different eco-modulation criteria in each of the 27 countries, meaning they have to change their packaging in different countries. From a sorting perspective, if you're going to produce higher quality recycled polymers, you need to look at how you're sorting the material. So again, flexible packaging as an example. We're now starting to see polypropylene being sorted as an individual stream, PE, mixed polyolefins, so much more granular sorting. Recyclers, lots of technology there, and people are working on deodorization, double filtration, etc., to get the qualities needed to put into those packaging applications. Also, there are some uncertainties around investability and things like chemical recycling, lots of drivers for it, absolutely, but some uncertainties as well, including some of those issues I've talked about in terms of how you would count recycling and recycled content. Converters, how you incorporate recycled content, availability of feedstock and cost. I mentioned earlier that historically recycled content has been used because it's cheaper than virgin. Now, quite often, in packaging applications, it's more expensive than virgin. So availability and cost are certainly factors for converters and brand owners. But despite all of these challenges and nuances and discussion points, I think the overall direction of clear is very clear in Europe. We're going to see more of a push for recycled content, more of a push for design for recycling. It's just a question of the detail, and it's that detail that's starting to come out now. So I will finish at that point. Cara, over to you.
Thank you, Mike. So interesting. I especially love that slide with the dark green and the light green to show the differences in eco-modulation. Very interesting. We only start my video. We only have one question in the Q&A for now, so I'll just invite those that are still on to ask any questions if you have any. This one says, at Stijn, for labeled bottles, would you need to have the watermark on the labels only or on the bottles as well?
It's actually a very good question. I think, first of all, if you have a product, specifically also in terms of EPR, I think it's very important to have a label that is designed for recycling as well. And specifically in South Africa, you have, for instance, Extrupet that is giving out certificates to labels that are designed to not hinder recycling. That's the first thing. And then, and that will not be, maybe not very surprising, but I would recommend to only do it in the bottle if it's not needed. We've seen that if the label covers enough of the surface of the bottle, that putting the digital watermark in the label is sufficient. And on the other hand, that also reduces quite a lot of cost on your end, because if you want to change something on your label, this is just a software change that we need to do. You change your graphics. If you want to change your design of your bottle, you would need to redesign your mold, which is, of course, a bit more expensive than just changing something in a software tool.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Shuri, I see your hand is up.
Thanks very much, Cara. I found I couldn't type my questions in the chat box, I think because I'm on the panel and I'm working on mixed screens. So forgive me for not putting my video on. But thank you so much to all the speakers. So interesting. I've got 3 questions for Mike. And maybe I'll ask them all together, then Mike can sort of answer them when he's ready. The first one was, Mike, in relation to the new measurement points in Europe, do you think that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation will play a role in getting those measurement points to be accepted globally, so that when we look at recycling rates around the world, we're able to compare apples to apples? So that was my first one. My second question relates to eco-modulation in a competitive environment, where EPR fees are seen as a potential competitive advantage, regardless of the achievements or the outcome. So how could eco-modulation be managed in that context? I guess the German EPR models could possibly answer that. And then my last question was relating to recycled content. And so interesting that you raised the question about availability and cost. I think particularly in South Africa, many of our members are feeling the bite of the higher cost of recycled content, always expecting it to be cheaper than virgin. And of course, it isn't. I'm really interested in how to prove recycled content, and then also to ask, in Europe, is recycled content accepted, whether it's recycled content manufactured locally or imported? Is it only Spain that has the taxes related to imported recycled content? And then I think I've really monopolized the question space. So that's it for me now. Thank you, Cara.
Okay, all very good and poignant questions. I'll try and answer them all. Sherry, if I forget anything, then feel free to prompt me. But the first point about the new measurement point, I think the first thing to say is Europe's trying to work it out at the moment. What's written in the law is clear. It's when it becomes an end of waste flake, which it could be for PET if it was going into a tray application or fibre, or it's just prior to the extruder. So the only thing you're not taking off is the filtration waste between, in terms of the final product. So the principle is clear. The practice is very, very difficult because you can't typically measure at that point prior to an extruder. And so each country at the moment is trying to work out how to measure it. I mean, the additional complexity obviously is different polymers. In particular, if you can consider the C&I waste stream, have different amounts of waste. So trying to get one figure that will work for a country in terms of estimates is difficult, but in reality, it's meant to be done case by case. So my first point is Europe's still trying to work it out, let alone the rest of the world. And actually, in November, we should see the first data using the new measurement point reported to the European authorities, and that's data for 2020. So it'll be really interesting to see that. In terms of directly your question, Ellen MacArthur, yeah, I don't know Ellen MacArthur's position on this, but I would imagine that they would be supportive of the idea that you measure it just prior to the extruder rather than as a bale where it contains the contamination and non-target material. And clearly they're very active globally. So I think my answer to your question would be yes, I would expect them to play an important role and probably to be pushing that message along with others that this is how we should look at it globally. Eco-modulation in a competitive environment, a particularly good question, as I think you know, I think asked from a point of knowledge. Yeah, I mean, clearly it's difficult to implement eco-modulation in a country where there's competition. So in the countries where you don't have competition, then it's not so difficult. You can choose your approach. But where you have competition, and in some countries there's quite a lot of competition, I think probably more than half of the countries now in Europe have PRO competition. And the extreme would be the UK, that I think has 48 schemes now. Germany has 11. So obviously, if there's a risk that you become uncompetitive if you set your EPR fees and eco-modulate in a certain way. And so what's starting to happen now is in certain countries are looking at mechanisms to enable eco-modulation to be brought in, which is a legal requirement, but not for it to impact on competition. So it's very much work in progress. Many countries haven't done it yet and haven't worked out a mechanism. I can think of examples in at least 2 countries off the top of my head where there are some PROs have eco-modulation and others don't at all yet. But for example, in Germany, the way that they've approached it, where they have 11 schemes, is that they have a body which sets minimum design recycling requirements for products to go on the market. So they set a minimum requirement, and if you're way off the requirement, you can't put your product on the market. And if you're close to that requirement, then that's an area where there can be a degree of eco-modulation. But at the moment, it's still very much an active talking point. How do you do it in a way where it doesn't distort the competition? So not all of the answers are there, but it's probably likely to involve some sort of central body or central intervention to make sure that the rules are set out in a way where there aren't intended consequences, and in particular, that schemes trying to do the right thing aren't penalised through loss of members by setting fees in a particular way. And recycled content, the answer to your question in terms of whether or not you could use material from any country will depend on the individual country and what we're talking about. So taxes, eco-modulation, in principle, those different bodies could choose different rules. Spain originally tried to have it just using Spanish material, and actually that was reversed because many of the brand owners were saying, no, you're breaking the single market if you do this. So at the moment, the direction of travel is to not have geographical restrictions on where that recycled content is coming from. That in itself is good from a perspective of a single market, but it introduces additional challenges where you could have competition between the different systems. So if your tax is higher in Spain than in the UK, just to pick a random example, if that was the case, then you could see recycled material being pulled towards Spain and they're less being in the UK. So what we might start to see is a bit of battle for material based on the incentives, be that a tax, be that an eco-modulation, etc., etc.
Thank you very much, Mike. I think one of the key things that I pulled out of your answers in terms of the competitive market, most of the countries where there are competing PROs have very specific rules regarding that. And I think good compliance or good monitoring.
Yes, the only thing I would say is that eco-modulation is probably behind where it needs to be in Europe in terms of the legislation. And so there are many countries where it's quite embryonic. And so I think the answer is that I think what you're saying is correct in countries that have been doing it a long time and are quite big countries like in Germany. But in some other countries, it's still very much work in progress in terms of how it will be implemented.
Okay, thank you, Mike.
All right, there are 2 more questions that have come in, both for Stijn. The first one is watermarking being trialed in countries which are dominated by informal collection systems at all? What would be the impact on informal collection, especially where sorting is being done by informal collectors?
I think it's a very interesting and very relevant question for South Africa, right? It has not been tested so far. However, I think there's a very key decision that has been made now already a year and a half ago within the Holy Grail consortium that we wanted to step away from any kind of monetization via an app or something. So the information that is in there can actually just be read by a smartphone. So if you tap on, if your phone can make a camera, you notice that something will pop up. So this is something that actually will, we believe, simplify a lot of the interaction with a consumer. But in the case of waste pickers, like in South Africa, this could be a very good help as well. Is this something that this recycling organization will take? Yes or no? Quick scan of the phone will double check and will have you that information. So it is something that still needs to be explored, how further this can go. But it can give more granular information to actually the waste pickers, and also make sure that the material that that is actually good that is now not collected. I mean, in certain cases, there are shrink sleeve materials that do perfectly go into a recycling scheme. If you then know, okay, this bottle we accept, you will actually increase the amount of material that goes into the stream. So I think there are definitely opportunities, but it has not been explored to extent, but it's been prepared. That answers the question, actually.
Thank you. And then one more question for Stijn. It says, I know the digital watermark is still in its early phase, but what are the projections for when advances like digital watermarking will become commonplace in countries like South Africa, for example?
Yeah, of course, the question that I was expecting there. It will depend. I'm going to be very honest. So for us, the most critical part now is coming now on the large scale implementation. If this works on industrial scale, and there's a huge study ongoing that will be finalized actually 2 weeks from now on the economic effect of all of this and the economic sort of business case for countries, for recycling organizations, for recyclers, and so on. If that turns out to be positive, and a lot of those signals are already looking at a very positive signal, there will be a lot of demand from other regions, what we see. Realistically, I think we will see the first the economic aspect and then the technical aspect that should be finalized somewhere during next year. And a lot of different regions have already reached out to the Holy Grail organization saying, okay, if we have this, can we actually see how we can bring this into our market in there? So for South Africa, I think it's a matter of, if this is of interest, to start a conversation sooner than later and see how much information we can still share that is not shared in my short presentation, and get everyone involved, because of course you need local recyclers to have such an add-on module. And also to have brand owners to want to have this product digitally enhanced on the shelves in South Africa. So it takes a while in there. So, but if there's an interest, there's absolutely no reason why this couldn't go relatively quick, because a lot of the work already has been done in terms of technical details. It's now just making sure that the business case works for the South African brands and the market in its whole.
Is just one more question. It says to Mike, what is the strategic vision to involve poor countries in the circular economy? For example, Mozambique that imports more than it actually produces. Any view on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe more a comment than a view. I mean, clearly there are some organizations such as Ellen MacArthur, also now the UN, that are looking at this kind of international level in terms of circularity. So I think there are now forums for that to be discussed and addressed. What I certainly notice is that many countries, I don't know about a specific example of Mozambique, but many countries do have circular economy policies and legislation in place now, many in developing countries as well. So I think it's coming everywhere. I mean, there's a lot happening in South America. There's a lot happening in Asia. Of course, there's a lot happening in Africa. So I think circular economy is definitely on the agenda, and there are some organisations now looking holistically and globally at this as well. So yeah, I'm hopeful that we're moving in the right direction on an international level as well as just on a kind of a regional level.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. I don't see any more questions. And so in the interest of time, I'm just going to wrap up. Firstly, I just want to say thank you so much to Mike, Stijn, and Marco. I know that you're all very busy, and it was really, really interesting and insightful for us to be able to learn from you. And thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge with us. It's always a great learning curve for us, and we look forward to hopefully partnering in the future and bringing some of these innovations to South Africa. So thank you so much again for your time and for your effort and for for everything that you put into this morning. And with that, I'm going to close the session. Thank you to everyone who's attended. And I'm going to leave the chat open. If you have any other comments, I will put my email address in here now in case you have any questions. As mentioned, I will be sending out a recording of the session, and I will also send out PDFs of Mike and Stijn's presentation. Thank you, Lucas. We've got all of your email addresses. No need to type them into the chat. So with that, I'm going to close the session and allow everybody to get on with their days, and have a great Tuesday and rest of the week, everybody.